Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to this session. We're not particularly numerous. I think people are still a bit tired from this wonderful program that we've had so far, this wonderful boat tour yesterday. I would like to thank Major General Rachmanidis and his team, of course, for hosting this wonderful conference, and also Dr. Efraxia Pashalidou for asking me to chair this session. This is a particular pleasure, even though it's 9 o'clock in the morning, of course, and on the fourth day where we're all a bit tired, but I hope the papers will allow us to wake up quite rapidly. So I won't waste too much time with pleasantries, so that we can move quite rapidly into the papers, that the speakers have enough time. Just very briefly, let me remind you the rules of engagement. 20 minutes per paper. I will give you the first reminder after 15 minutes, and closer to the 20 minutes limit, I will become ever more insisting in case you try to go beyond 20 minutes. That sounds a bit harsh, but then we'll have enough time for questions. I would also be grateful if you would speak not too rapidly, so that everybody can understand your message and your argument. Now, it is my very pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Associate Professor Dr. Dmitry Minchev, who actually is very well known to most people here as the organizer of the 38th, the 40th, and the 42nd International Congress of Military History, of course, in Bulgaria. Among his many positions, his CV is far too long to go into much detail. Of course, a distinguished career in the military and in academia. He was, among other things, a visiting Fulbright scholar at Stanford and Loyola University in the United States, an honorary professor at the Russian Academy of Natural Sciences, and is currently the president of the Bulgarian Commission of Military History. He was also the chief of the Military History Research Center in Bulgaria, and in the past, much further back at the time of the Cold War, was a battalion commander. He's also the author, of course, of numerous books and articles, far too many to list here. So it's my pleasure to look forward to the paper, the 1876 April Uprising in Bulgaria and its repercussions in the United States. Please, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, we are holding our Congress at the historical moment when a 200 years period of the Greek War of Independence was taking place. There is no question that this war influenced in one or other way the movements for liberation in the neighboring Balkan nations. For example, here is first and second, first 1806, 1812, and second 1815-1830, Serbian uprisings. The niche Bulgarian uprising of 1839-1841. Meanwhile, in Bulgaria, at this very 2021, are having our 145 years of the 1876 April uprising. The latter, due to the heroic struggle and sacrifice, together with cruelties over the Bulgarian population, led to a discontent in Europe that allowed Russia to start the Russia-Turkish War of Liberation for Bulgaria, 1877-1878. It used to be during the years of the Bulgarian revival that the idea of a restart of the Bulgarian state arose. 19th century is the century of the nations, and before the Bulgarians stated the next step to an organized revolution towards the Ottoman government. Members of the Bulgarian Revolutionary Central Committee met at a meeting in the Romanian town of Giurgiu at the end of 1875 and decided that the political situation was suitable for a general uprising. It was scheduled for May 1876. The territory of the country used to be divided into 5 revolutionary districts, with centers in Vratsa, Lydia Stoyan-Selimov, Veliko Trnovo, Stefan Stambolov, Sliven Ilarion Dragostinov, Plovdiv later moved to Panegyuriще, to town Panegyurište, Panayot Volov, who later gave his position to his assistant Georgy Benkovsky, and in Sofia, Nikolai Obretinov. The rebels had been holding arms and ammunition for some time, and even constructed a makeshift cannon out of cherry wood. They themselves constructed that. On April 13th, 1876, a general meeting of the committees from the 4th Revolutionary District was held in the Oborište, a locality near Panegyurište, in order to discuss the proclamation of the insurrection. Ottoman counterintelligence was informed, and on April 20, 1876, the police made an attempt to arrest the leader of the local revolutionary committee in Komplivnica, Todor Kardishkov. In conformity with the decisions taken at Oborište this very day, the local rebel committee surrounded and attacked the headquarters of the Ottoman police in Komplivnica, commanded by Necip Aga. At least 2 Ottoman police officials were killed, and Necip Aga was forced to release arrested Bulgarian rebel suspects. Necip Aga and his close officials managed to escape the siege. However, due to this incident, the Bulgarian rebels had to proclaim the insurrection this verse was not for revolt. No connection with the revolution. This incident, the Bulgarian rebels had to proclaim the insurrection 2 weeks in advance of the planned date. Within several days, the rebellion spread to the whole Sredna Gora, mountain Sredna Gora, and to a number of towns and villages in the northwestern Rhodos. The insurrection broke out in the other revolutionary districts as well, although on a much smaller scale. The areas of Gabovo, Trevna, and Pavlikeni also revolted, as well as several villages north and south of Sliven and near Berovo in the present-day North Macedonia. The Ottoman powers mobilized detachments of regular troops and also irregular Bashibazuks. These forces attacked the first insurgent towns as early as on April 25th. The Turkish forces massacred civilian population, the principal places being Panegyurište, Perishtica, Brcivo, and Batak. By mid-May, the insurrection was completely suppressed. One of the last sparks of resistance was poet Hristo Botev's attempt to come to the rebels' rescue with a detachment of Bulgarian political emigres resident in Romania, ending with the units Rota and ending with the units Rota and Botev's death. News of massacres of Bulgarians reached European embassies in Istanbul in May and June 1876 through Bulgarian students at Robert College, the American college in the city. Faculty members at Robert College wrote to the British ambassador as well as to the Istanbul correspondents of the Times and the Daily News. An article about the massacres in the Daily News on June 23 provoked a question in Parliament about Britain's support for Turkey and demands for an investigation. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli promised to conduct an investigation about what had really happened. In July, the British Embassy in Istanbul sent a second secretary, Walter Baring, to Bulgaria to investigate the stories of atrocities. Baring did not speak Bulgarian, although he did speak Turkish, and British policy was officially pro-Turkish, so the Bulgarian community in Istanbul feared he would not report the complete story. This is why they asked the American consul in Istanbul, Eugene Schuyler, to conduct his own investigation. Schuyler set off for Bulgaria on July 23rd, 4 days after Baring. He was accompanied by a well-known American war correspondent, Januarius McGahan, also by a German correspondent, and by a Russian diplomat, Prince Alexei Tseretelov. Schuyler's group spent 3 weeks visiting Batak and other villages where massacres had taken place. Schuyler's official report, published in November 1876, said that 58 villages in Bulgaria had been destroyed, 5 monasteries demolished, and 15,000 people in all massacred. The report was reprinted in a booklet and widely circulated in Europe. The suppression of the uprising led to interest and moral support in Europe. Diplomats and journalists expressed interest. The most detailed contemporaneous account was that of Eugene Schuyler, as said, in an American and British service. He was general counsel in the British Embassy in Istanbul. Together with the American journalist Januarius McGahan, they started a search concerning the results of the uprising. The American historian Richard Millman states that Schuyler personally visited only 11 of the villages he reported on. Schuyler had, however, certainly visited Batak and many other of the destroyed towns and villages, including Perustica and Panagurishte. Millman also claims that the accepted reality of the massacres is largely a myth. According to British and French figures, 12 to 15,000 Bulgarian civilians were massacred during the uprising. Meanwhile, McGahan's vivid articles from Bulgaria moved British public opinion against Turkey. Against the Ottoman Empire. He described in particular what he had seen in the town of Batak, where 5,000 out of a total of 7,000 residents had been slaughtered, beheaded, or burnt alive by Turkish irregulars, and their bodies left in piles around the town square and the church. McGahan was born on June 12, 1844 in New Lexington, Ohio State. His tombstone in New Lexington reads, McGahan, Liberator of Bulgaria. After the cruel suppression of the April uprising by the Ottoman powers in 1876, he did an enormous work in defense of the Bulgarian nation. In his capacity as correspondent for the Daily News, he, together with the Secretary of the United States Legation and General Counsel in Istanbul, Prince Schuyler, visited the Bulgarian towns and villages which had revolted. He precisely identified the exact number of the killed Bulgarian victims and the number of the villages, churches, and monasteries set on fire. The results of his studies he published in the English newspaper, Daily News, and in the Russian newspaper, Ghost Voice. At the end of July 1876, McGahan also visited Plovdiv, and beginning August, the towns Pester and Pazachi. After them, After that, he traveled to the village of Batak. He sent to his newspaper a clear report of the massacre done by the Bolsheviks of Ahmednagar Balkani. He exactly determined that from 7,000 population, there were only 2,000 survivors. He confirmed. He found with horror that along the streets, in the churchyard, and in the school of this Rodopi mountain village, still were lying the bodies of thousands of killed Batak inhabitants, while in the air was a terrifying stink from the bodies. His report about the Batak repressions in the London newspaper Daily News shook the sleeping conscience of Europe. He entitled it Letters from Hell, Batak, the Valley of the Death and of the people with no tears. It follows. They told us that it is only Sunday. In the little churchyard there are lying 3,000 people. That was a striking revelation, something that would be following him all of his life. Little curly heads were shown here and there, smashed under the headstones. A little leg in length like a finger, little baby hands. Expressed as asking for help. Babies that have died astonished by the shining of a sword. And children that have died among cries of horror, young girls who have died weeping while praying for mercy, mothers who died in an effort to save their little children with their bodies. All of them are lying here, decomposing together in an awful mess. What we saw inside the church is a horror, even at a glance. Numerous decomposing bodies filled half of the space of the very church. We wandered along the village and we saw the same brutalities hundreds and hundreds of times. Everywhere, skeletons of men together with the clothes and the meat on them. Skulls of women with hairs in the dust, bones of children and babies. Everywhere, horrors and horrors. The Ottomans bloodily had taken babies from the cradles with the bayonets, and after throwing them a couple of times from bayonet to bayonet, as a ball, they threw them in the faces of the mothers.
Sorry to
Liberal Party.
5 minutes left.
Yeah, thank you. A Liberal Party leader William Gladstone published a pamphlet on the 6th of September 1876, Bulgarian Horrors and the Question of the East, which attacked the Israeli government for its indifference to the Ottoman Empire's violent repressions on the April uprising. Gladstone made it clear that his hostility focused on the Turkish people rather than on the Muslim religion. The Ottomans, he said, were upon the whole from that black day when they first entered Europe, the one great anti-human specimen of humanity. Wherever they went, a broad line of blood marked the track behind them, and as far as their dominion reached, civilization disappeared from view. They represented everywhere government by force as opposed to government by law. For a guide of this life, they had a relentless fatalism for its rewards in the hereafter essential paradise. The political impact of these reports was immediate and dramatic. As the leader of the opposition, Gladstone called upon the government to withdraw its support for Turkey. I entreat my countrymen, he wrote, upon whom far more than upon any other people in Europe it depends, to require and to insist that our government which has been working in one direction, shall work in the other, and shall apply all its vigor to conquer with the states of Europe in obtaining the extension of the Turkish executive power in Bulgaria. Let the Turks now carry away their abuses in the only possible manner, namely by carrying off themselves. Prominent Europeans, including Charles Darwin, Oscar Wilde, Victor Hugo, and Giuseppe Garibaldi, spoke against the Turkish behavior in Bulgaria. When war with Russia started in 1877, the Ottoman government asked Britain for help, but the British government refused, citing public outrage caused by the Bulgarian massacres in the region. The April uprising was a failure as a revolution, but due to the publicity given to the reprisals that followed, it led directly to European demands for reform in the Ottoman Empire. The Istanbul Conference of the European Powers, January 1877, and the Russo-Turkish War for Liberation of Bulgaria, 1877-78, which ended in Turkish defeat and the signing of the Treaty of San Stefano, March 3, 1878, followed in July the same year by the Treaty of Berlin. The revolution thus ultimately achieved its original purpose, the liberation of Bulgaria from the Ottoman Empire, and later, of course, its independence. My presentation should be with Colonel Willard Snyder from the United States, so he is not available. I had a chance to read it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and I'm also grateful that you so carefully respected the time limit. It's now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker on this panel. It's Associate Professor Tomasz Ciesielski. Apologies if I didn't pronounce that properly. To introduce the speaker, he graduated with a PhD in 1997, specializing in Polish history. Later, in 2010, he obtained his habilitation in the humanities in history, specializing in the history of modern Poland and general history of the 16th to 19th centuries and military history of the so-called Old Polish era. Currently, he is an associate professor at the Department of Modern History at the University of Opole, where he now is also the director of the Institute of History. He's the chairman of the Military History Group in the Historical Sciences Committee of the Polish Academy of Sciences. Tomasz, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, because I couldn't crash in the limit of my limit time to presentation, I prepared a PowerPoint presentation in which you find some information about Polish uprisings. It is complete to my speech. Within the history of the Polish state and nation of more than 1,000 years, the most tragic period, lasting 133 years, was the loss of independence when an autonomous Polish state didn't exist and the territories of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were divided between three states: the Russian Empire, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Habsburg monarchy. The most important events of the period, as recognized by the Polish historiography, included three national uprisings of 1794, 1830 to 1831, and 1863 to 1864. All there were aimed against Russia. Why? You can see how many territory of Poland like Russia, 63%, but after 1815 it was 70%. And all Polish uprisings ended in complete failures, military defeats of grave political consequence. The fall of the 1794 uprising resulted in the third partition of Poland and effectively ended sovereignty of the Polish state. Following the fall of the next uprising, the autonomy of the Kingdom of Poland, which became a component of the Russian Empire, that in 1864, after another national uprising had been quenched, became a Russian province called the Vistula. At this point, it should be explained that due to a political status of the changing emanation of Polish statehoods, switch off my telephone. Excuse me. Okay. The emanation of the Polish statehoods and participation of regular armies in the fight of 1794 and 1830 to 1831, the events of those years are also referred to as Polish-Russian wars. In reference to 1794, the so-called the Second Polish-Russian War, that term is definitely adequate, as it was not an uprising raised in order to regain independence, but in order to defend it. At the time, the Polish state had all attributes of a sovereign state, including a separate ruler, a government, a parliament, and a legal system. However, since the 1770s, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been a Russian protectorate, and after the lost war of 1792, it became an actual satellite state. In 1830, the situation was quite similar, as the Kingdom of Poland, creation in 1815, remaining officially in personal union with the Russian Empire, and the attributes of the sovereign state in the form of a constitution, a separate legal system, a government, and a parliament. However, it was deprived of the right to conduct its foreign policy, and the chief of the army of the Kingdom of Poland, Grand Duke Konstantin Romanov, was in fact Russian governor. But when in 1794 and 1830 the Poles began the war with the Russians, they had regular armies to use, and quite large ones for matter. In 1794, there were 40,000 soldiers, and during the uprising, the regular army was expanded to 70,000 soldiers, with militia even 90,000 soldiers. When the uprising broke out, the Russians had in Poland corps of approximately 30,000 soldiers, and it took them 12 months to reinforce it to 70,000. Between May and September 1794, according to various estimates, the fight with the Poles were supplemented by 20, maybe 30,000 of Russian soldiers. Therefore, we cannot speak of definite advantage of the enemy forces, especially as far as the levels of weaponry, training, or readiness for military operation are concerned. The Polish infantry was better ready as the Russian one. Another stage was strong artillery with 250 guns. The weakness included quite poorly trained and prepared cavalry, poor engineering and logistics, lack of permanent fortification. The most significant shortcomings included the necessity of expanding the army based on recruits lacking even the most basic preliminary training. Weapons and ammunition were insufficient, and the poorly developed arms industry in the country, in Poland, was capable of manufacturing relatively small amounts of powder, for only 40 guns and a few hundred rifles. However, the quality was low. In fact, almost half of the army lacked firearms and had to resort to weapons as primitive as scythes. The same shortcoming applied in 1830 to 1831, when the production capacity reached up 27 guns and 5,000 rifles. Trained reserve force were also lacking, but weapons reserve was larger, amounting to even 40,000 rifles, but outdated. However, the army of the Kingdom of Poland presented itself primarily much better. It had well-developed engineering and logistics, strong artillery with 150 modern guns, and special rocket artillery troop. And moreover, there were two strongholds in Zamość and Modlin, along with partly fortified Warsaw. The army itself consisted of approximately 30,000 soldiers, well equipped, disciplined, and trained in garrison service, regularity, and marksmanship of infantry fire, or maneuvering the troops, but unfortunately they lack the ability of acting in field operation. Another shortcoming was the lack of heavy cavalry. Nevertheless, one should agree with the statement, there was no more beautiful, better trained, disciplined army than the Polish one in the time of Constantine. What is more, the battle potential of the Polish troops was not inferior to, and in the case of infantry, was even superior to the Russian ones. Meanwhile, when the uprising broke out, in the Kingdom of Poland, there were only 10,000 Russian soldiers. So within the first weeks of the uprising, those troops related to the Russian border, which resulted in the uprising forces, Polish uprising forces, controlling almost the entire territory of the Kingdom of Poland. It created favorable conditions for expanding the Polish army. Despite the material shortcomings listed above, approximately 100,000 people were recruited and the field army more than doubled in size. However, it was still too weak, as the Russian army operating in the kingdom had 90,000 soldiers and about 400 guns in action in the defining moments of uprising. Total number of Russian soldiers directed to suppress the uprising was 150,000 soldiers, and it was over half of the imperial field army in this moment. The Russian side had extensive reserves, both human and material, whereas the Polish side faced the end of its mobilization potential. All battle when Polish lost 2,000 soldiers, it was completely ruin for army. As for the disproportion in the potential, the situation in the winter of 1864 looked far worse when the third Polish uprising broke out. The conspiracy, conducted almost continuously from the 1830s, resulted in the uprising potential within the first weeks, estimated at 20 to 20,000 people. However, they lacked practically any military training or any necessary equipment, including weapons in the first place. Even though the white arms didn't look so bad, there were only a few thousand rifles and pistols, mostly hunting or using modern ones, sport weapons. It was assumed that the insurgents would arm themselves at the expense of 140 Russian garrisons scattered across the country. But in the Kingdom of Poland, there was approximately 100,000 Russian soldiers equipped with 176 cannons. It was an overwhelming military predominance, resulting in the fact that after a few weeks of struggles, the Russians regained control over most of the kingdom territory, including all cities. Even more so, considering that the insurgents managed to destroy only several Russian small garrisons and military posts. This resulted in the dreams of gaining weapons for the insurgents being completely shattered, and all attempts to bring to the territory included in the uprising weapons purchased in European countries failed too. And in Poland, it was impossible to manufacture anything except primitive white weapons. As a consequence, despite the fact that it should be estimated that over the 14 months of the uprising, even over 150,000 Poles and other nations passed through the insurgents troops, only maximum of 30,000 were battle ready. The exchange was the support of the civilians, however, until the winter of 1864. The Russians gradually reinforced their troops operating in Poland, mainly by means of light cavalry and infantry, most useful in anti-partisan actions. It is estimated that 200,000 imperial soldiers, about 40% of Russian field army, were engaged in the pacification of the Kingdom of Poland, and even though small groups of insurgents still operate until 1864, in the spring 1864 uprising was ended. However, the failures of free uprising shouldn't be sought only in a large disproportion between the Polish and the Russian forces, and the following must indicate it. Lack of proper military preparation in subsequent uprising, beginning with establishing proper command structures. In 1830 and 1863, officers capable to take command were searched frantically after the beginning of the uprising. Only the uprising of 1794 had a commander-in-chief Tadeusz Kościuszko. However, he was taken captive by the Russian. It was impossible to replace him with anyone capable of rebuilding of morale of the army and continuing the fight. The measure of the political leader's helplessness was appointed Tomasz Wawrzecki as the next commander-in-chief. He was not a professional officer, had no war experience, and was no expert in warring tactics. For this reason, he practically begged not to be appointed the commander-in-chief. However, he didn't succeed. At the same time, he didn't have a general military staff as one none of the uprising actually had one. In 1830 and 1831, only a provisional military staff existed in the form of 2-3 staff officers serving under commander-in-chief. However, frequently they only developed operational plans on their own without even consulting other officers. Another problem was the quality of the officers and commanding troops. In 1794 and 1830-1831, it consists of people with war experience, which resulted in an effective way of commanding regiments and other small military units. However, in the reality of war, they were unable to command large military formation. Moreover, some of senior officers were not quite convinced that the uprising was a good idea at all, and it could be successful. Which resulted in a tentative style of command. During the January uprising, the command was exercised by officers of no great or military experience, and even if they had some, it can be quite in the Russian army, commanding companies at most. There were almost a few volunteers arriving from Europe. Most commanders, however, were completely amateurs, and even their best intention couldn't balance their lack of military experience or even lack of predisposition for leadership. Next, lack of operation plans. It resulted in prompt loss of strategic initiative, gained only for the short periods of time and not always leading any improvement of the Polish army's situation. The most effective operation was in spring 1831, most tragic operation October 1794 and winter 1864, ending in defeating almost the entire insurgent forces. I think that also the problem was not well-chosen tactics of warfare. For example, in the uprising of 1794 and 1831, Poles could fight with normal tactics, but they marginalizing or completely eliminating the possibilities offered by the so-called Smart War. In 1864, the partisan operation was conducted, but unsuccessful were all attempts to go to small regular war. Perhaps maybe a simple lack of luck in war as well. Of course, lack of money, sufficient resource to wage war, and the absence of all in 1863, 1864. Poorly used demographical potential. Only a small part of the inhabitants of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Kingdom Poland lands participated in the uprisings. Why? Because there was no socio-economic proposition for bourgeoisie or for peasants. The uprising lacked a grain of revolutionary ideology in the internal affairs and rationality in the foreign affairs. Preparation for all free uprising failed to obtain international support for the Polish cause. The hopes to gain the goodwill of states other than Russia participating in the partition of Poland failed, and in 1794 Russia even granted military aid to Russia. The greatest disappointment were related to France, and in 1794 to the Ottoman Empire, but not help was obtained. And meanwhile, subsequent uprising in Europe proved that in order for them to succeed, external aid was necessary. About it talked Mr. President on the first speech in this Congress. However, such help was impossible to obtain in the event of uprising aimed at Russia, which constituted an important component of the international forces balance since the second half of the 18th and the entire 19th century was impossible. The great European powers were unwilling to disturb the international conflict in this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also again, not only interesting, but also you managed to keep the time. Very grateful for that. That will leave us plenty of time for Q&A, which of course will be after all papers have been heard. Now, it's also my pleasure again to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nobuyoshi Ito, who is a research fellow with the International Conflict Division Center for Military History at the National Institute for Defense Studies at the Japanese Ministry of Defense. He studied international relations and diplomatic history and obtained a PhD from Keio University in Tokyo, Japan. He previously occupied the position of Research Associate in the Graduate School of Law at Keio University and was Torii Fellow in at the Suntory Foundation before he joined the International Conflict Division, where he works now. His research, and I think that's related to his talk today, focuses on the British Empire and its imperial legacy after decolonization and contemporary European history, especially during the Cold War period. He has published relatively widely and notably not only in Japanese but also English. So please, the floor is yours to say a bit more about this master narrative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for kind introduction. Dear my colleagues, good morning. It's my great honor to participate in the Congress today. I will talk about the end of empires and decolonization. There have occurred numbers of independence wars, and they have also had broader influences, especially in the latter half part of the 20th century. The trend of decolonization reflected the independence movements and anti-colonial struggles, which became one of the most fundamental transitions of the international order. Historians have actively argued the end of empires, and they have focused mainly on the process of independence movements and imperial retreats. At the same time, however, we should take account of the impact of decolonization on the contemporary world, particularly between current situations and their historical backgrounds. Nevertheless, the contribution from imperial history is much less, despite its huge accumulation of knowledge of decolonization. This presentation argues anti-colonial movements and the end of empires in connection with the post-colonial context, and reconsiders implications of independence wars and decolonization in contemporary world, paying attention to the significance of imperial legacies, mainly British, in political and security issues. Many phenomena surrounding our world have originated in geopolitical rivalry and can be seen as typical cases of power politics. The importance of geography has again come under the spotlight as conflicts over sphere of influence between major powers have intensified. Along with these situations, interest in empires and their legacies have also increased. Recently, one scholar argues that the legacies of empires on today's world are significant, indicating that, quote, it has been the role of empires to animate and organize themselves to clash with each other, and today it is after images of empires that sets clashes in motion, unquote. In addition, connections between the modern world and empires can be seen everywhere. It is simply that the modernization of the world in itself started from Europe. This historical development led to the colonial rule in the global level, and power politics between the European colonial empires intensified. The imperialism among the European powers in this era was rather symbolistic. The 20th century again marked another historical turning point, particularly after two world wars, namely anti-colonialism. Then occurred the independence movements, many of which resulted in harsh independence wars and conflicts. These phenomena led to historical upheavals, such as a stream of decolonization and birth of the Third World and North-South problem and the rapid globalization. So, it can be said that, again, that the worldwide imperial experience are in deep connection with contemporary issues. Findings from imperial history, including anti-colonial struggles, independence wars, and their imperial legacies, could be accumulated. However, imperial historians have not been interested in those interrelationships. They have focused more on empirical analysis of colonial rule and decolonization than on suggestions for their legacies. There is even poorer contribution to current security issues from imperial history. Some scholars have made introspective criticism of the situation. For example, one influential imperial historian proclaimed that the British imperial history was too consolidated on the studies of decolonization. He strongly criticized the indifference to the contemporary world after the end of empire. Still, despite these acute criticisms, the situation seems hardly changed even today. This tendency to focus on the decolonization as the master narrative is remarkably typical when historians deal with the end of British Empire. The most notable example is the British decision to abandon its military commitment outside Europe in January 1968. The Labour government announced that Britain would withdraw forces from east of Suez by the end of 1971, which meant that it would not be maintaining military bases outside Europe and the Mediterranean. This event symbolized the decline of Britain's world role and had certain impacts on the broader international relations, so that historians have paid much attention to it, and their main interest has been the process towards the determination. However, even if its military involvement moved from the empire to Europe, Britain still had its dependent territories and military bases around the world. Under the context of the Cold War, its world role, including the maintaining of empire, were vital to allied states and local authorities. Even after the East of Suez decision, the British government suggested its option to redeploy forces beyond Europe in some time. Thus, the more active research on the British continuing political military commitment after empire is needed. Based on these backgrounds, we will argue as some cases of the independence and anti-colonial movements against the British Empire before overviewing influences of those movements on contemporary issues. Here, this presentation will see wider cases of independence movement in order to make room for dealing with more examples. Furthermore, for the local people, their struggles were justified to gain their self-determination and expressions of nationalism, while these were regarded as insurgencies or uprisings for empires. At first, the colonizers tried to suppress the local actions as by means of counterinsurgency, but these coercive measures gradually reached a limit, and finally colonial authorities were forced to change their policy, leading to the imperial retreat. Then, this presentation will consider the independence movements and decolonization, focusing on the British Empire much more broadly. In Southeast Asia, Britain experienced harsh insurgencies and anti-colonial struggles after the Second World War. Just after the war in Asia Pacific, the rise of nationalism and anti-colonial sentiment brought about the deterioration of law and order in the region. The British Malaya, where British influences continued from the 19th century, turned to be in the place of disorder. Although Britain reconquered it easily, successive economic and social problems led to the insurrection by communists in June 1948, which forced Britain to declare a state of emergency. Britain took severe attitudes to suppress the revolt, and at that stage, the abandonment of the imperial rule was out of question. Besides, Malaya was strategically vital in the context of the Cold War in Asia. The United States considered the containment of the communist regime as the biggest object in its foreign policy. In such cases as Malaya, where the British colonial rule was useful to refuse the communists, the US bolstered up the maintenance of British Empire rather actively. This paradoxical imperialism of decolonization highlights the course of events. Then, as nationalism and demand for independence rose, the Malayan Federation achieved its independence in 1958, although the emergency would continue for another 3 years. In addition, the defense treaty with Malaya enabled Britain to have a big strategic position in Southeast Asia continuously. On the other hand, Britain's effort to make a greater Malaysia turned out to collapse. The creation of Malaysia in 1963 brought about Brunei's opt-out and secession of Singapore in 1965. Britain also had to support a newly established association due to the escalated tension between Malaysia and Indonesia, confrontation from 1963 to 66. When confrontation was finally solved, this enabled Britain to reduce military commitment to Malaysia and Singapore remarkably. As is described in a document of the British Foreign Office, it marked a turning point of British policy in Southeast Asia. However, the local government still needed British support. At the height of the Vietnam War, the United States also hoped for British continuous military contribution. Consequently, the Anglo-Malayan Defense Agreement was reorganized to the private power defense arrangement, and British political military commitment on Southeast Asia, also weakened, remained a cornerstone of the regional security. British continuing presence was more typical in Brunei. When Brunei became a self-governing state, Britain has its responsibility for its foreign and defense affairs. A revolt erupted in 1962, but only to be suppressed instantly. In 1971, Brunei became full self-government, while its foreign and defense policies were still shared with Britain, and it strongly hoped for British military commitment. In the late 1970s, Britain tried to withdraw from Brunei, but again had to agree to keep station. Britain feared the international criticism of the remaining colonialism, but Brunei itself insisted on the British presence. Accordingly, Britain was forced to retain its military commitment even after Brunei gained independence in 1984. In this sense, Brunei is an exceptional case of decolonization in Southeast Asia. Since then, the British Army in Brunei, centered on a Gurukha unit, have played an important role of its defense. Next, in the Middle East, the impact of the dissolution of British Empire was much bigger. After the Second World War, it might be anticipated that Britain would abandon its prestigious position in the Middle East sooner or later, although the local order was not ready for this situation until 1960s. When the British government expressed its plan to withdraw from east of Suez, the protectorate in the Persian Gulf was suddenly forced to stand on their own feet by 1971. At first, there was serious confusion and distrust, but once it became clear Britain should no longer maintain its commitment, the Emirates in the Gulf quickly began seeking their way of survival, which in turn led to the foundation of the newly independent states. Thereafter, though the British relation with the region were maintained, its influence over military affairs diminished. The transformation of the regional order would be not until the beginning of the direct commitment by the United States in the end of the 1970s. On the other hand, the Mediterranean remained one of the key points of British military commitment in the post-war imperial era. The region was regarded as a hotspot during the early years of the Cold War, and British contribution to the security was also indispensable, especially for NATO. Of course, in the history of the British Empire, the region constituted the important position leading to India, and this empire route symbolized British naval mastery until the first half of the 20th century. The stream of decolonization, however, spread over the Mediterranean as well. In Cyprus, for instance, the British authority faced many difficulties with successive independence struggles. In the 1950s, the revolt in the island caused much severer reaction by the British and brought about an infamous example of counterinsurgency, worsening a serious ethnic conflict between Greek and Turkish Cypriot at the same time. Cyprus gained independence as a sovereign state in 1960, but the dispute was never settled. Britain continued to bear its responsibility for the territorial integrity of the island as a guarantor, together with Greece and Turkey. After that, British political and military influences in the Mediterranean grew weaker. The Mediterranean Fleet of Royal Navy, which had been based in Malta, was dismantled in June 1967. Fierce anti-British movement also erupted in Malta, coming down to independence in 1964, and later in the 1970s, the Maltese government claimed to Britain for the complete withdrawal. As a result, Britain and its NATO allies had to admit that all forces stationed in Malta should be withdrawn by 1979. Despite this tendency, remnants of the British imperial rule persisted in Cyprus as the sovereign-based areas, SPAs, of Akrotiri and Dekeria. While there have been constant suspicions over the usefulness of the bases, two SPAs still embodied Britain's military presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, and its allies, especially the United States, made much account of British continuing commitment through its military bases. In the mid-1970s, when the British government sought to abandon SPAs, with Cyprus conflict getting worse, the US and NATO strongly asserted that Britain should keep its military commitment in the island, not only in the context of the Cold War, but also from the perspective of conflict resolution.
5 more minutes.
Thank you. Under those pressures, Britain had to reverse its initial decision to withdraw all forces from SPAs and reluctantly admitted that it would continue to retain its military presence in Cyprus. In this manner, the British military commitment in the Mediterranean was partly maintained. For Britain, this result was unintended and unexpected, but accidentally enabled Britain to maintain its capability to pursue the military operations outside Europe. After the end of the Cold War, for instance, Britain had many occasions to have joint military missions with the United States in the Middle East. Besides, the SPAs were to be regarded as the remains of the imperial past But played an unexpected role for Britain, since Akrotiri base was used as a frontline base for air operations against Islamic State since 2014. Therefore, the legacies of British Empire and its continuous political military role, though indirectly and partially, have had non-negligible influences on broader regional order even today. For Britain, the retention of forces outside Europe did not reflect its intention in the era of decolonization, while this half-hearted presence had much impact on subsequent developments. From the geopolitical point of view, the political military legacies of the British Empire have been one of the key elements of the international order. Historians who have concentrated on decolonization as a master narrative too much cannot always shed light on the broader implication of the end of empires. Thus, more research and analysis are required on the interrelations between the process of decolonization, independence movements, and contemporary issues. The example in this presentation are just simple paths, and many other phenomena should be also taken up. Comparative viewpoints among the cases between empires will give us a fruitful knowledge in the history of decolonization and will contribute to the further discussion. It will be worthwhile considering the continuity between past events and current situation, especially in the context of shaping world order today and the consistent pursuit of national interest overseas by each country. The experience of British and other colonial empires in the late 20th century will give us a rich suggestion to the past, present, and future. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and excellent timekeeping. So I am looking forward to a fruitful panel discussion, and I hope there will be a good number of questions for these three papers. May I ask people who would like to ask a question to state their name, affiliation, and national commission? Are there any questions? Yes, Adam.
Adam Storing from the British Commission for Military History. I have a question for Dr. Cieśliński. Sorry, I think I pronounced your name wrong. I would like to ask you, please, to reflect in the context of the Polish uprising. I would like you to could you reflect a little bit more on the reasons, the more underlying reasons for the original loss of Polish sovereignty, or for the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It is, of course, a large state in many ways. It was not. It was. Could you talk about the reasons why the partitions were possible in the first place, and the degree to which that transferred into the reasons for the failure of the uprisings? Do the uprisings reflect the same kind of factor that led to the original loss of independence, or is it a new situation?
Thank you, Adam. Are there any immediate other questions? If there are many, then I would take some in a row, and then they can answer the questions. Carmen, please.
A very short question for our colleague from you mentioned the Bulgarian Revolutionary Committee. Can you please give us more details or insights about this committee, its composition, how it was settled, and if the movement was an exclusive local one, or it was some support from abroad? There are other powers involved somehow supporting the Revolutionary Committee, providing some funds or things like that. So anyway, if you can give some more insights about how this Revolutionary Committee was created and supported. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a third question? In this case, I would like to ask our Polish colleague to start, and then Professor Milczek, please.
Thank you, Adam, for your question, but to answer on your question, it will be problematic. Because if I want to explain the reason of the partition of Poland, and the next, the common of this partition with uprising, this reason with uprisings, I need about 2 hours, minimum. Shortly, the reasons of Polish partition are political situation in Europe, in Central Europe in this time. So the first, I think, maybe the rivalization between Russia and Prussia first, to the end of 7 Years' War. Next, the problem with Austria. Third, the Russian ambition named Eastern Question. It was made a situation when common these 3 countries, Russia needs something to offer. Russia offered Prussia the partition of Poland first in 1772, but this partition had not common with free uprising about, I thought, because the first partition was after the so-called Confederation of Bar, the nobility movement against against king and permanent staying in Poland, the so-called Russian-Polish Corps. It was on the territory of Poland from 1758, and after the end of 7 Years' War, this corps couldn't go back to Russia. This is political. Inferior situation is problem with Polish budget. In fact, the Polish state, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, from the beginning to the end, have always problem with money. Money for not only for military expense, but for all expenses. Second was Polish, the so-called Polish nobility autonomy, which related also on divided Polish, in fact, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in fact, on 2 countries, 2 nations, Polish and Lithuania, and next to the voivodeships, to the districts, voivodeships, countries, and others, and of course weakness of the Polish army. A Polish army in 18th century, for the long moments, from 1717 to 1777, have only about 22,000 soldiers, and territory of Poland, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in this moment was more than 700,000 square kilometers. When I was trying to think about how many soldiers was on 1 kilometer of Polish borders, I must change question. On 25 kilometers of borders, 1 soldier.
Please be concise in your answer.
If I make more, I must be the same. What is the first common? The problem with insurgents of 1794. It couldn't happen in this moment. Related to partition, in this moment for Poland, first things was to wait to Catherine the Second was died, because all knows in this moment that almost all things concerned to the Polish independence belongs to the Catherine II, the Russia.
Thank you.
The Bulgarian revolutionary movement was started in the 19th century from Bulgarian emigres, mainly in Romania. Of course, a lot of emigres were Serbian in Serbian Greece too, but in Romania was the most productive when in Bucharest a lot of our emigres organized not only the revolutionary set in Bulgaria, but organized and armed detachments with which crossed a couple of times, a lot of times in Bulgaria, trying to, of course, not to reach the liberation, but to create troubles for the Ottoman Empire, while the organized revolutionary movement being organized seriously. All those what I talked about, organization was done in Bucharest in the even before 1870s. So my paper was mostly concentrated on the April uprising, which was the result of all this organization, and of course in 1876. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Jordan, please. Apparently not, sorry. There doesn't seem to be one.
Okay. I don't want to ask something, but just one contemporary comment, because Dimitar mentioned William Gladstone, who opposed Disraeli's policy, pro-Turkish policy, criticized him, and later on he became Prime Minister of Great Britain, of the United Empire. About contemporaneity, last year some immigrants in Great Britain, probably some people knows that, tried to abolish the statue of William Gladstone because of so-called colonial legacy. And Bulgarian community in Great Britain issued a declaration in defense of William Gladstone because of his defense of Bulgaria. This is contemporaneity and history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting addition here. Any other questions? Jan, please.
Jan Hofnaar, Netherlands Commission of Military History. I have a question to Dr. Ito. Thank you first for your excellent expose, very wide theme. As I understand well, you have had, you said that imperial historians do not have a real interest in the consequences of the decolonization process in nowadays international relations, and you have done quite a lot of research, I know, in the British archives, and but I'm interested, is it possible for you to tell us just in a couple of sentences, few sentences, what are the main consequences of the way the British try to decolonize their empire for the international relations today? Can you pinpoint some main consequences?
Thank you, Jan. Are there any other questions? Yes, Piet.
Piet Kamphuis, the Netherlands. In addition to Hofnaar's questions, I also would like to ask a question to our colleague, Dr. Ito. I like your paper enormously, focusing on Britain as an example. But I wonder, could you reflect on the Japanese legacy? We all know that in 1945 there came an end to the Japanese efforts to have their own large empire. But if I look at, for instance, Taiwan, that had been on a Japanese occupation for many years, where the majority of the people are still very favorable in their opinion on the Japanese. If I look at the current security cooperation between the United States, Australia, India, and Japan, then I've got a feeling that there is a kind of strategic continuity in the Japanese thinking. So my question is, what is the Japanese legacy?
Thank you. Do we have a third question? Then I will add my own questions of the third one, so to speak. My first one would be for both our Polish colleague and our Bulgarian colleague, which would be both your papers are very interesting, but I found it somehow that they were very mono-perspective. I was wondering, because in a conflict you have always two sides. So especially when it comes to the more qualitative analysis, whether you could say it's a bit more about driving forces, rationales and motivations on the opposing side. And then for Nobuyoshi, very interesting paper. I agree, of course, with the observations made by Jan and Pete that it's very fascinating. I have a couple of questions in relation to it, actually. The first one would be in terms of historiography. So you made a very strong and fascinating historiographical point that imperial historians haven't necessarily looked sufficiently at the consequences. Now, could you please substantiate this more and identify the historiography more tangibly, that we, who and perhaps who has attempted, there's such historians also such as Frederick Cooper on imperialism, continuities, discontinuities, pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial. And I was also wondering where you meant Kenya was there at the end, but Africa was a bit absent from the whole picture. And especially now, have you thought, looking at it perhaps a bit more comparatively? Because you have the decolonization processes, and of course the go-to comparisons are Britain and France, because they were sort of somewhat contemporaneous, their empire. The decolonization processes happened fully following the Second World War, and whether there's dissimilarities. Because if you look at Africa, for instance, well, it's still very much the impact of the French presence, whereas Britain has largely withdrawn, perhaps not in East Africa fully, but so whether perhaps there would be potential for more comparative analysis, but you could think of it. And lastly, I was wondering whether you could perhaps say a bit more about, when it comes to the impact that colonization and then the decolonization process had on our current security order. During the process, what was the impact between, what was more important according to you? Was it the international setting, pressure on empires, that kind of stuff, or was it rather the regional or sub-regional setting? Or lastly, was it the local setting? Because if you look at Malaya, for instance, in the insurgency, it was very much, because it was a Chinese insurgency that was not Malay, and they were quite easily to be isolated. Whereas in undercountry insurgency campaigns, it wasn't that easy. And of course, the international setting was still more benevolent towards some counterinsurgency methods that would be more critically regarded upon today. Thank you very much. So please, perhaps we start with Nobuyoshi because he has the most questions this round, and then we complete with our Polish and Bulgarian colleagues.
Thank you for your questions. All of them are very, very important and very difficult for me to answer. And the first question is about the consequences of the Turkish Empire. And in the security issues, as Britain, as I showed in the maps, there still in many areas, Britain still has the military bases overseas, and these are very closely connected to the Britain's national defense policy, and especially after the Brexit, Britain had sought to expand again its influence all over the world. To be honest, I am a little bit skeptical to this strategy, but now the aircraft carrier Queen Elizabeth are now traveling very near to Japan, and in autumn maybe Japan and the UK will have a joint operation, joint exercise. And this international cooperation arena, British imperial legacy, especially in the military aspect, still have some kind of impact in the international security environment. And it is just the symbolic impact of the British presence itself in such areas. So, of course, the British Empire itself disappeared, but the remnant of its imperial experience still has a certain influences in the local authorities and local order or regional order even today. So much more research about on the contemporary situation, much contemporary historical analysis is required. So this is my future object of the research. Thank you. And the second question reflects the legacy in Japanese Empire. It's very difficult for me to answer a very sensitive position. And yes, in case of Taiwan, as you said correctly, very favorable legacy still remains in Taiwan. And historically, just after as the Asia-Pacific War ended, Japan at first regained the bilateral relations with China. The China meant the Taiwanese government and the Republic of China, not the communist regime. And it was not until 1972 when Japanese government changed its policy to recognize the People's Republic of China, Beijing, and then
Try to be a bit more concise in your answers,
yeah.
please.
And then stopped its relations with Taiwan, but still Japan has many connections with Taiwan informally. So these legacies now remain, and Taiwan is very exceptional case in comparison with Korea. So it is very sensitive issue for us. Thank you. And my second third question about the comparison of the other regions such as Africa and Bedouin empires, Anglo-French connections. Thank you very much. Very interesting. And in fact, regarding the French and Dutch empires, there are some accumulations of knowledge of the imperial legacy rather than British. So it is very mysterious for me. And so in Africa, the British government at that time very closely watched the situation in Algeria, French Algeria in the 1960s, and really reflected the British policy, imperial policy at that time. So it may be many chance to make a comparison between empires. But this comparative perspective is also just have started. So this is a very important issue for the historians in the future. So this is my answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dimitra, and then we move on.
If I correctly understand the question and the idea, the liberation is, Bulgaria as a case, is not an only short act of the Russo-Turkish War. It's a long years standing struggle, and then after the war, the Berlin Treaty came, which divides Bulgarian territories in different districts and countries. Was needed, first of all, to make unification of North and South Bulgaria, then a couple participating in Balkan and First World War in order to obtain other territories which are with the Bulgarian population. Was unsuccessful, of course, more than unsuccessful. But nevertheless, in the year 1908 was declared the independent Bulgaria, totally independent, from which the state was organized as independent one.
Thank you. Tomasz?
Thank you, very interesting question. I shortly answered. Russia haven't any possibility only suppress Polish uprising. Any concession for Russia were to failure of the Russian policy to be an important countries in Europe, to be empire. As today, some politics think that loss of Ukraine is a greater weakness of today's Russia. And Russia have all things to go to suppression Polish uprising. Big army, big military reserves, and they have also allies in European, Prussia, Austria, even if they don't give it finally. And third, Russia can count for help from the Polish people. A lot of Polish people in all these uprisings were on the Russian side. For example, in 1863, vice-director of the Polish Bank refused uprising government to give money. In this moment, money for insurgents was something great because they could be buy rifles from the corrupt Russian officers. And to Bulgarian, we must know that several thousand of Polish people fight in Bulgaria, in a Bulgarian uprising, of course, in Russian army. Several of them was officers commanding companies and battalions, and few was also commander of a regiment. This is why Russia needs Poland and why couldn't give Polish independence in this moment.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've come to the end of this panel. Please join me in congratulating the speakers again for a very interesting panel, and thank you very much for attending. Oh, excuse me, our colleague Mr. Minchev would like to make a brief announcement.
The acta for the Congress in 1919 in Bulgaria are available in printed version downstairs at the registration desk. Please take one for each commission, and members of the Bureau have the right to take one. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
Each auto